laws in Wisconsin that you would change or you have to
I believe that Wisconsin's 2011 Act 23 voter ID laws should be a thing. I feel as though voter ID laws prohibit certain individuals from getting to the polls because they have to take the time to get their license and spend money on transportation to get to the DMV. I think that
I respectfully disagree with this statement. Wisconsin does offer free public transportation to the DMV through the buses, as well as offering a free voter ID for people who are going to vote. So I believe that voter ID laws do not affect people.
Act 23 denies 300,000 citizens of Wisconsin the right to vote, and only provides 17,000 of them with this program. So I don't think that's very bad.
started by when we were told we were going to do question 3, I have to resign. We want to do question 3 because I tend to think personally this is that voting is talked about a lot in our country, and it should be. It's an important right, but it's not our only right. And there's certain groups of people that don't have the right to vote, and not just what Michael was bringing up, that there's people who choose not to vote, witnesses, and there's undocumented students that don't have the right to vote. So if you go any further, I'd just like you to remember that there are other demographics that you should consider and maybe bring more information on the demographics not represented and the information votes. But I would have liked to have gotten to more of that, and we just didn't have enough time. But overall, you did a phenomenal job, and you touched on a lot of the issues that are being talked about currently in our country. So good job.
Surround sound.
Yeah.
The initial was pretty good. Bringing in the I wanted to ask a follow-up. If you have this question, using more research with the whole thing with felons and criminal appeals, you basically don't get sentenced and then get out, you get right back to vote. You do, technically. However, the recidivism rate is huge. That's why there have been a number of books written out including New Jim Crow laws. We disenfranchised a huge chunk of the minority population in the state. Is that good? Is it bad? That, not for me to say here, but that's the consequence of losing the right to vote. So we've got that, and that's something, if you take this one step further, you should think about. That shows thought down beyond just the initial.
Representing Wauwatosa West, we're all juniors. I'm Simon Inks.
I'm Anna Beisch.
I'm Christopher Bonte.
And I'm Ellen Schaefer, and we are accompanied by our instructor, Chad Teske, our TAs, Aubrey Anagaro, Nicole Maestro, and Adam Pendos, and also our mentors.
Excellent. All right, we have chosen today question number 2. In what ways were the founders influenced both positively and negatively by past governments and governments from their own time? Why did the founders distrust direct democracy and prefer a representative or Republican form of government? And why did the founding generation believe that a constitution should function as a type of higher law? You may begin.
Ancient Greek historian Plutarch once said, "Make no mistakes is not in the power of man, but from their errors and mistakes, the wise and good learn wisdom for the future." Never was the study of history more pivotal than in the founding years of the United States of America. Many of the founding fathers were highly cultivated in the political philosophy underlying government from all ages. The culmination of this knowledge was the U.S. Constitution.
From ancient Athens, the founders learned that direct democracy was highly susceptible to tyranny. Composed of all male citizens, their lawmaking assembly seemed virtuous, but it soon became evident that when given complete power, citizens violate the rights of others. Furthermore, the people's rash judgment regularly led to the execution of intellectuals, including Socrates. After reading about Athens from men like Thucydides, Plato, and Aristotle, the founders came to distrust the passions of the people in a direct democracy.
From the Roman Republic, John Adams and other founders studied the evolution of mixed government with checks and balances. Cicero's De Republica chronicles the segmented yet interdependent Roman government, including the legislative public assemblies and senate, the two executive councils, and the judiciary plebeian tribunes. Each body's appointment or veto powers ensured that none could become overly powerful, and one-year terms checked individual ambition. The resulting virtue of the Roman Republic later rematerialized under the checks and balances of America's mixed government.
Checks and balances are intended to slow legislation to ensure protection of liberty. However, in times of crisis, when energetic action was required, the Roman Senate appointed a temporary dictator. But this contingency failed when Julius Caesar took power, resulting in the rise of the despotic Roman Empire. The founders realized that while a dynamic executive is necessary, their power must be limited.
By far, the founders' largest influence was the British Empire, which governed the colonies for over a century. The colonists understood themselves to be British subjects, hence entitled to all rights granted to Englishmen. These esteemed rights, provided for in documents such as Magna Carta, the Petition of Right, and the English Bill of Rights, were intended to function as higher law. However, due to the uncodified nature of the British Constitution and Parliament's use of simple majority vote, common legislation could easily infringe upon long-honored rights.
For example, the Administration of Justice Act, which deported colonists to Britain for trial, clearly violated Chapter 39 of Magna Carta, which states that no free man is to be arrested or imprisoned except by the lawful judgment of his peers. Had Magna Carta been true higher law, this act would have been void. Therefore, the framers included the Supremacy Clause in the U.S. Constitution to ensure, as Thomas Paine wrote in Common Sense, that in America, the law is king.
The question itself of the Constitution functioning as a higher law. Do you think you equate constitutionalism with higher law, or do you see constitutionalism as an instrument to implement higher law? Where are you at on it? Your thoughts?
I think our government today, in the Supremacy Clause, Article 6, Section Clause 2, states that our Constitution is higher law, and therefore the Supremacy Clause makes all the contents of the Constitution higher law.
An integral part of Thomas Paine's definition of constitutional government is higher law, so I believe that higher law is a part of constitutional government.
However, I do not believe that higher law is completely necessary for a constitutional government. You could regard Great Britain as a constitutional government. However, during the time of the American colonies, documents such as the Magna Carta were not regarded as higher law.
You also note that the framers also had this issue with regards to the Articles of Confederation, and that they needed to replace the articles with something that was more effective, and integrated into that dynamic executive, as you called it. And you reference the Roman sort of example, but you make no reference to Machiavelli's role with regard to sort of defining out this kind of dynamic executive that Hamilton was sort of had a big hand in creating. How does that dynamic executive work with regard to this kind of representative government?
Well, in our government, we have the president, who is the executive, but they are checked with the system of checks and balances, which was taken largely from Montesquieu. And so we have a dynamic executive, but we have limited them with our checks and balances.
Do you think the framers were over worried about direct democracy, given the fact that we've, in the last 200 plus years, we've become much more democratic, how we operate? Okay?
I do not believe that the founders and framers were overly worried about the direct democracy. A direct democracy is very dangerous, and as Thomas Jefferson once said, a decision made by the people themselves is not generally distinguished for its wisdom, and so the voices of the people need to be checked with representation.
So what about a recall in your statement of the governor? Is that direct democracy dangerous?
I don't believe that the recall is dangerous. For example, there was the recent recall or attempted recall of Governor Scott Walker, which failed. But I think if the citizens feel that a recall is necessary and are willing to go out and collect signatures to have the recall put on ballot, then I think it shows that whoever is attempting to be recalled has done enough bad things that people don't like that they should be allowed to recall them.
I agree with my colleague Simon. In Federalist 51, the people, according to the writer, the people are the fountain of all authority, so if the people see it fit to recall a governor, they have the right to do so.
Furthermore, in Federalist 10, Madison stated that enlightened statesmen will not always be at the helm. And so if we don't have enlightened statesmen leading the nation or a state or any branch of government, then the people should be able to take that power back and put someone who they think is enlightened.
Talk about checks on.
Wauwatosa West High School, we're all juniors. My name is Max Routine.
I'm Virginia Bogatti. I'm Elizabeth Foxbender. I'm Faith David.
And I'm Joy Holden. And we're here representing our teacher, Chad Metesky, our mentors, and our TAs, Adriana Miro, Adam Lendo, and Nicole Wexler.
All right, well, good morning. Today you'll be answering for question number 3, I believe. All right, so a widespread public debate over the ratification of the Constitution raged for almost a year. What important purposes and integrity were served by that debate? Why did the delegates to the Philadelphia Convention debate the rules for the ratification of the proposed Constitution, and how they justified in doing so? What role did the newspapers and analysts at that time play in educating the public and furthering its discourse? How would you compare today's media with the media of the time of ratification?
The debate over the ratification of the Constitution was one of the most spirited and closely contested in American history. Arguments raged on for months and eventually culminated in ratification and the promise of the Bill of Rights. These debates served important legal and philosophical purposes in setting precedents for nonviolent public debate in the young nation.
The widespread debate helped promote democratic practices and classical Republican principles. Ratification was such a critical issue that some states changed their voting requirements to allow more people to vote for the delegates to the ratifying convention. This practice, as well as the accessibility of information regarding ratification, encouraged civic engagement. The fact that ratification was to be done by state convent codes supported the classical Republican idea of tightening community directions.
Conventions also helped advocate for Republican government because representatives were chosen for the conventions to act on behalf of the general public. The nonviolent debate also set the precedent. However, the most important purpose served was the ultimate ratification of the Constitution. The Massachusetts Compromise helped the Constitution pass by promising a Bill of Rights. The faith that this condition would be met demonstrated great trust in the new government.
The delegates to convention needed to create new rules for ratifying the Constitution. Article 7 of the Constitution laid out the procedures for ratification, requiring state conventions. This was a perfect early example of popular sovereignty, the people of the convention entering into a social contract. Through ratification, however, the new ratification required a 9/15 majority, not a unanimous confirmation. We hold that this new method for ratification was justified.
The majority required was reasonable, and a rule for unanimous confirmation would have promoted the success of the convention. As Hamilton noted in Federalist 23, the ends justify the means. The new Constitution was technically not authorized under Article 13 of the Articles. However, without the Constitution, the Union most likely would have broken down and been left to the mercy of the Belgian country, as mentioned in Federalist 7.
The Constitution would not have passed if not for the media of the time. The level of interest was so immense that the Federalist and Anti-Federalist papers had a profound impact on the opinions of the general public. Although the different viewpoints were all represented, the mainstream media was strongly Federalist. This impact was most evident in that the Constitution was indeed ratified.
The overarching goal of the media was the same as today, trying to win public support in one way or another. The intent was to sway people towards ratification or away from it, which helped create factions and promote partisan politics further down the line. The media was at times completely false. For example, the allegations of inappropriate relationships held by John Adams in the election of 1800 were bold-faced lies. Today, the media can still be biased, but it is slightly more subtle.
While sources may claim to be unbiased, it is common knowledge that different broadcasts have their own political leanings. With so many new outlets of information, citizens must choose what to believe, especially considering that biased or false information can spread like disease online. There is much more transparency today than at the time of ratification. As Andrew Cantor put it, there's no hiding the information. This means that for better or for worse, politicians are constantly under the spotlight.
At the time of the convention, the secrecy rule helped prevent the public opinion from influencing the delegates. Now, with the politicians constantly focusing on re-elections, anything they say can and will be held against them in the court of public opinion. As the nation has evolved, so has the media. The early debates over ratification of the Constitution most important debate for modern democratic and Republican ideals of government. The ratification of the nation's framework document did eventually happen, but only after debate and the birth of the two factions. The media today shows the overall characteristics of the early media, but is more easily accessible and shareable. For better or for worse, this transparency has changed the interaction between representatives and constituents, and will surely play a role in the public policy debates moving forward.
In the argument, there was a philosophical reason for state conventions. There was a political reason for state conventions, other than just get 9s easier than 13. Any political reasons for Article 7?
Well, politically, Article 7 was much more simplified than the Articles of Confederation, and I would actually argue that the Constitution was as well. One of the biggest gripes with the Articles is that it can be very confusing at times. Article lines are extremely long. Article 7 was one sentence long. It was very simplified, and it just made it easy to understand.
A way of saying is that no one in a room will always agree with each other, and the way that the majority agrees with each other will eventually bring a higher vote.
I mean, hold on. Why not give it to state legislatures? Conventions, why not state legislatures?
I believe that having state conventions really allow the people to have more of a say in the Constitution, and electing the delegates to the conventions try to promote more civic engagement in thinking about it.
And that's political because, and that's to everybody.
Because the people need to have a say in their Constitution, because as stated in Federalist 51, people are not without authority, and having the politics of our country basically being decided by the Constitution as it would be the higher law, I believe that the people really needed to understand that.
Thank you.
Nate Cohen gave an example from the today, and examples for some communities that have lies, Nate Cohen misleading. It's often this entire debate as reasons that the Federalist law are the short pieces that are within.
Well, I would argue that in the Federalist Papers, they were trying to sway people to ratify the Constitution, and not everything said in it could be taken literally. In a few Federalist Papers, they were stated that the states would be able to take power away from the national government whenever they wanted, and that wasn't truly evident until after the Civil War.
Also in Sentinel 1, which is considered the first anti-Federalist paper, there's some Munson against Federalists. Essentially just name calling, among other things. And also there were some harsh Munson against Alexander Hamilton paper.
I think that to get the Constitution to be ratified, the Federalists really utilized pseudonyms. For example, John Jay, he wasn't really a fan favorite at the time. He was involved in the Garden State Treaty, which many Americans were angry about. So by him using a pseudonym, it really made the Federalist argument reliable.
I would also argue that because most of the papers at the time were Federalists, it was hard for anti-Federalists to even get their work published. And if people had disagreements with each other, they would frequently challenge each other to duels, which wouldn't really be considered civil discourse.
I should be.
All right, so you guys have talked a lot about Federalist Papers, a lot about Federalist arguments. Can you delineate some of the anti-Federalist arguments, the strongest arguments that you have against the Constitution?
Well, one of the strongest arguments that they had against the Constitution was the amount of power that the Constitution is going to give to the executive branch. Federalist 69 by Hamilton came back and said that the executive was not going to be like a king compared to Britain. We were going to put the checks and balances on his power, and the people would have liked it.
Another would be the representation, which under Article 1, Section 2, Clause 3 of the Constitution allows 3/5 of the African Americans of the South to be counted as a population or representation.
The judicial branch was also concerned, especially with the Administration for Justice Act under Great Britain. That was actually unconstitutional under the Magna Carta Article 39, so we were very concerned about the power of the judiciary branch.
And of course, one of their biggest concerns was the lack of a Bill of Rights for the Constitution. And that can be seen now that they have won that battle against the Federalists because our Constitution does include 10 amendments considered as a Bill of Rights.
And the fact that they trusted that the Bill of Rights would be added later on showed that the Federalists really had a good argument.
Good morning. We're Unit 3 representing Wauwatosa West. I'm Lauren Casper.
I'm Ian Newton.
I'm Clarence Diogo.
And I'm Noah Suki. We are joined today by our instructor, Chad Mateski, our teacher's assistants, Nicole Maestro, Aubriana Miro, and Adam Fendos, and our mentors.
And a couple of other people.
Just a couple.
Good, we're well supported. I like that.
All right, sorry to jump the gun there. We're going to start on question 3 here. So who are to be the electors of the federal representatives? Not the rich, more than the poor, not the learned, more than the ignorant. The electors are to be the great body of the people of the United States. They are to be the same, exercise the right of every state, electing the corresponding branch of the legislature of the state. Almost 2 centuries passed before James Madison's prediction became reality.
Governments are instituted among men, deriving their just powers from the consent of the governed. The Declaration of Independence established the right to vote as a fundamental principle of our government. Contrary to this ideal, the founders' fear of a pure democracy, such as in ancient Greece, compelled them to deny women and slaves the right to vote.
In the Constitution, the state's ability to deny voting privileges was given in Article 1, Section 4, Clause 1, which enumerates the times, places, and manner of holding elections for senators and representatives shall be prescribed in each state by the legislature thereof. This clause of the Constitution has provided for, in our opinion, the oppression of voting rights up to today. Because of the various property requirements passed by the states and the racial and sexist precedents, African Americans, women, and the impoverished were unable to vote in state and federal elections.
The enforcement clauses in the 15th and 19th Amendments allow Congress to enforce laws to protect voting rights of disadvantaged minority groups. After this, voting began to approach Madison's prediction, but states continued to prevent minority groups from voting. To combat this, poll taxes were made illegal with the 24th Amendment. Shaw v. Reno, Katzenbach v. Morgan, Smith v. Albright, and Gwynn v. United States prohibited racial gerrymandering, literacy tests, white primaries, and grandfather clauses, respectively. Discrimination in voting was struck down completely by the Voting Rights Act of 1965.
Voter ID laws have been challenged on constitutional grounds and have both been affirmed and denied, respectively, in the 7th Circuit in Frank v. Walker and the 5th Circuit in Texas NAACP v. Steen.
Despite these advancements in voting, we believe that James Madison's prediction is not yet a reality. The government is not based upon the ideals of the great body because nearly half of America does not vote, although they possess the ability to do so, and others such as non-citizens, minors, and felons are still denied the right to vote.
The largest issue with voting, based on a Census Bureau survey, is that 28% of people claim that they are too busy to vote. Our solution to this would be implementing the voting holiday. The same survey reported that 16% of people are not interested in voting, as proposed by Yale professor Bruce Ackerman. A deliberation day where people would meet to discuss politics would inspire more interest in government and increase voter participation.
Another issue is political gerrymandering. In districts controlled by one party, the opposing party will likely feel that their vote does not count and will have little incentive to vote. We believe that having a nonpartisan, independent commission, such as in Arizona, decide on redistricting issues would take away this aspect of political gerrymandering, removing the possibility of corruption in the process.
In Harper versus Virginia State Board of Elections, Justice Douglas stated that voting is a fundamental political right because it is preservative of all rights. By this reasoning, we believe that the right to vote is a fundamental principle. We also see the right to vote relating to other principles of our government. Egalitarianism is the concept that all men are created equal, as enumerated in the Declaration of Independence. The 15th, 19th, 24th, and 26th Amendments serve to ensure that minority groups are equal in terms of voting.
Popular sovereignty, the idea that government is derived from the consent of the governed, is expressed in Federalist 51, where James Madison states that the people are the fountain of all authority. Popular sovereignty is better protected through the passage of the 17th Amendment, which constitutes a direct election of senators, in turn making representatives more accountable to their constituents.
The classical republicanism principle of civic virtue was influenced by Aristotle, who argued that civic virtue involves citizens taking part in ruling and being ruled. By voting, people show consent for the current system, ensure their interests are protected, and uphold the concepts of our government.
We believe voting is a civic responsibility, and without it, the ideals found in the Constitution and Declaration cannot be upheld. Franklin Delano Roosevelt once said, "Nobody will ever deprive the American people of the right to vote except the American people themselves. And the only way they can do this is by not voting." Thank you. This concludes our statement, and we are now ready for follow-up.
That was popular sovereignty, and then citizen names. In terms of who gets to vote.
I believe that popular sovereignty directly correlates with civic virtue because by voting, people express their consent to the governed as enumerated in paragraph 2 of the Declaration of Independence.
To address your second part of your question, there are still parts of groups of minorities that are still not able to vote. For example, felons who are not able to vote in such instances for life, inmate in Vermont.
Some people would believe that this is a violation of their 8th Amendment rights because, such as inmate in Vermont, if they cannot vote even past being freed from jail, they believe that that is cruel and excessive.
However, this has been affirmed constitutional in Richardson v. Ramirez, which held that because the 14th Amendment in Section 2 states that no man can be deprived of the right to vote except in cases of crime.
Are you more comfortable with the federal government taking control of, let me restart my question. Is the federal government or individual state governments more likely to, on a practical level, implement legislative tools to increase voter turnout?
One legislative tool I believe could help increase voter turnout would be mandatory voting. In Australia, there is a 97% voter turnout after they implemented mandatory voting, and I believe this would have to be on a national level to ensure equality across the board in terms of voting.
I believe that giving incentives to voting would be a good idea, as Marquette decided that a penalty of up to $150 would be a decent amount of money to fine if someone was to not vote.
Although if mandatory was implemented, the right for Washington, D.C. to vote would be essentially taken away because they're only allowed to vote in federal elections. Therefore, there needs to be an amendment in the Constitution that enforces mandatory voting and as well gives Washington, D.C. the right to vote in more than just presidential elections.
However, the issue with mandatory voting and the federal government having more control over that is what if people cannot have transportation to the voting areas, or they have a mental or physical disability or handicap?
Getting back to your question, I believe that it is more up to the states to regulate and make legislation on voting because state voting is more what impacts you more than federal voting.
I'm going to push against that idea a little bit in a follow-up and say that isn't there something to be said, though, about an individual being able to exercise their freedom of speech by protesting voting? Isn't there something to be said about that? So wouldn't mandatory voting or imposing a penalty cut against that?
I could definitely see this. One controversy is that minors do not have the right to vote, and they argue that they do pay taxes through their jobs if they do have jobs at 16. However, like you said, the ability to protest, petition, or send emails or write to politicians is a way to still get involved and hold a stake in society. And therefore, that is why mandatory voting maybe isn't necessary, because you can still hold a stake in society.
I personally come from a country in West Africa where mandatory voting is in place, and I believe that many people vote there because of fear. And yes, if people were given the option to not vote, it's protesting their information.
I politely disagree with my colleagues. I see voting as a civic right as well as a civic duty on the same level as jury duty. Quote Governor Jerry Brown, voting, like jury duty, is a prerogative and responsibility of citizenship.
I have another follow-up on this one. Just really quickly, so it's a civic duty to vote, but then what is it? Just you have to vote? Do you have to educate yourself beforehand? To what level should you have to educate yourself before you vote, or could you just cast a ballot for the better looking?
What Yale professor Bruce Ackerman wanted or established in one of his papers he wrote about a deliberation day is that the day before the elections, a group of people would get around, watch the debates, and then discuss afterwards, so then every single person in that debate group would be able to be educated about what's going on.
Thomas Jefferson wrote in the Declaration of Independence, "The government derives its power from the consent of the governed." I don't believe it is
up to us to decide when the governor are educated enough to vote.
I agree with my colleague Ian that a deliberation day would be an effective means to educate the people, because as it stands now, 39% of people do not know all three branches of government.
Furthermore, 4 college professors did a survey to try to prove the participation hypothesis, and they said, and they quoted Bruce Ackerman, saying that if you get involved in one aspect of government, you are more likely to get involved in many other aspects of government.
That I believe that people should have to take a civics test, like our class will have to take next year to graduate high school, to be able to vote.
Going back to Lauren's answer, that survey found that 9% of people who participated in jury duty in a criminal case, issued a verdict, and hadn't voted in 50% of previous elections, were 7% more likely to vote in the next elections.
Yeah. Wow, that was tremendous. You hit all the big points very well. You had a historical narrative down. You backed that up with case law and with some pretty impressive knowledge of the Constitution itself. One thing I would say is with some of our questions, it sounded like you took the part of it that sounded familiar and you ran with it, because you didn't respond directly to the question. In all cases, you got around to it eventually, but there seemed to be front end but overall, a very impressive knowledge, very impressive presentation style. You guys obviously worked the team extremely well. Good job.
Very impressive, all of you. Excellent preparation. I was minding my mind to come up with constitutional questions that weren't addressed in the presentation. That was having very if I had in mind for a point of improvement, perhaps just because it's so right now, particularly in the study of constitutional law and voters' rights as related to the Constitution, a little bit more discussion of some of the practical tools that the Arizona Nonpartisan Committee that have been used at a legislative level to address gerrymandering.
Yeah, I'm going to echo what Nick said. You guys were clearly very well prepared. She did not have much of a Christmas break. So it was very impressive, and I felt that you all demonstrated a good knowledge of the kinds of issues that are out there right now. Had examples of, this is happening in Arizona, this is happening in Maine. You've had examples of where that was happening, and not just like, oh, this is out in society right now. So I thought that was really good. As far as some constructive criticism, I do agree with Sam that I think sometimes the question wasn't actually answered. It seemed like almost a little too rehearsed, like, will you talk about that, and then I'll talk about this, and I'll talk about this, and 3 of the comments maybe weren't necessarily germane to the question that we were asking. So I guess just be a little bit more filtered in the future, but once again, that allows you to bring up a lot of issues at the same time. So really, really good job, and congratulations, guys.
Thatcher once said, Europe was created by history, America was created by philosophy. The rich evolution of the monarchy and British government has created the government of one of the strongest world powers today. The United Kingdom gave birth to the principles of our American government.
There was no formal creation of the British Parliament. Its political development arose from the needs of the king in his government. An important milestone for the British Parliament was the adoption of Magna Carta, a part of the United Kingdom's uncodified constitution. It limited the monarchy's power of taxation in chapters 9 and 22, and extended civil rights and liberties to citizens in chapters 20, 24, 30, and 34.
Similar to U.S. Congress and its own bicameral system, the British Parliament consists of a lower house and an upper house. Like our own House of Representatives, the House of Commons is referred to as the lower house, responsible for creating budget bills and most directly representing the people. The House of Lords is comparable to our upper house, the Senate. While they are similar, our Senate has a more direct role in passing legislation and provides numerous checks and balances on the other branches of government. However, unlike Senator, Lords are appointed by the Crown and may hold their chairs for a life instead of 6 years. This would not be constitutional in America under Article 1, Section 3, Clause 1 of the Constitution, and the 17th Amendment.
Under the Parliament Act of 1911, the House of Lords was stripped of much of their power. The House of Lords cannot reject a legislation, but can only delay it for a maximum of 1 year. They are also not allowed to deny any money bill passed by the Congress.
In the United States, the president serves as the head of state and government. However, in Britain, the roles are split. The British Prime Minister serves as the head of government, with the Queen reigning as the head of state. In the United States, the president is completely separated from the legislative branch, whereas the Prime Minister is both a member of the Commons and its leader. Since the Prime Minister is chosen by the party in power, legislation produced by their party is likely to pass through the Commons with ease.
This mingling of powers is much different from the government in the United States. When writing the Constitution, the framers were aware of the British government, its flaws, and its successes. Philosophers influential to the framers of the Constitution, such as Harrington, Locke, and Montesquieu, believed that a successful government should check and balance itself.
The UK Parliament also consists of a multi-party system, which can allow for more diversity and participation than the two-party system in the United States. While the Conservative Party and Labour Party are dominant, smaller parties also have a voice. For example, the Liberal Democrat Party formed a coalition with the Conservative Party in 2010. This is very different from the United States, where the Republican and Democratic parties crowd out third parties.
Elections are carried out in different ways between Britain and the United States. Within the United States, Congress serve for 6 years, and elections are staggered, as 1/3 of the Senate is re-elected every 2 years. Representatives are elected or re-elected every 2 years. The House of Commons holds elections at least every 5 years, unless the government calls for a re-election or the minority parties call for a vote of no confidence prior to the 5-year mark. Members of Congress must live within the state they're representing. However, members of Parliament who virtually represent districts they do not abide in based on party recommendations.
There is a remarkable difference between the speed in which the American and British systems enact legislation. In 1916, after the AA mass school shooting, the conservative government of John Major passed the Firearm Act of 1997, banning handguns. In contrast, after the Sandy Hook school shooting, the Manchin-Toomey bill proposed requiring background checks before gun purchases. But the bill was filibustered in the Senate and died the same day as its proposal.
Britain and the U.S. have different governmental systems, but the true strength of both is the value placed on effective government and liberty by each. No matter how good it may appear on paper, a government without that fundamental value will never well serve its people. Thank you. This concludes our statement, and we are now ready to talk.
Which is better, Parliament or Congress?
We compared the judicial system of the U.S. and the Parliament. In my opinion, the judicial system of the United States is more effective in protecting civil rights and liberty of the people. This can be shown through the cases of Wicks versus U.S., Overkill versus Hodges, and Brown v. Board of Education.
I think that parliamentary systems have done better to serve governments that are trying to transition into democracy. It's easier for parliamentary systems to form. There's a body of scholarship surrounding Robert Dahl that agree that a parliamentary system is less prone to authoritarian collapse. Since World War II, nearly 2/3 of countries transitioned into
democracy have done so successfully through the parliamentary system. In contrast, no third world country since World War II has successfully transitioned into a democracy using a constitutional system without experiencing a constitutional breakdown.
Also, Parliament can pass legislation much quicker than the U.S. can. In the 1970s, there was a bomb at a bar, and a legislation, Prevention of Terrorism Act, was passed 3 days after it occurred.
This can be contrasted to our Patriot Act, which was passed almost 2 months after the 9/11 attacks on October 26th in 2001. This was one of the fastest times we've ever enacted legislation. But I think that this efficiency that we utilized in this system, our system, wasn't as effective because there have been many times when the constitutionality of the Patriot Act has been brought up in question as it's violated 4th Amendment rights. So you can see that this efficiency also in Parliament in such a declaratory act isn't always a positive aspect.
Raise the question of constitutionality. An act of Parliament be unconstitutional?
In Parliament, there is no codified constitution, but the citizens of the United Kingdom have a very high respect for higher law, and their uncodified constitution consists of Magna Carta, the English Bill of Rights, and other acts of Parliament. So while there is no written constitution to deem any of the acts unconstitutional, they can decide for themselves based on their own opinions on the Constitution. The members of the House of Commons and the House of Lords and the citizens of the United Kingdom.
So an act of Parliament.
Yes, we believe so. However, going back to my thought about judicial systems, in 2005, the Parliament introduced the Congressional Reform Act of 2005, which gave introduction to a Supreme Court. However, there's still debates going on between introducing the concept of judicial review, since Parliament is kind of opposite the concept of parliamentary sovereignty.
So you have someone mentioned the relation between the House of Lords and the Senate. What is that? What's the most important difference?
Like we said, a couple important differences are the Lords are appointed by the Crown, and the Senators are directly elected under our Senate.
What about the power? Power.
In America, the Senate can turn down legislation that passed through the House. However, in Parliament, the House of Lords cannot turn down legislation that passed through the House of Commons.
Let's do good things. We had some very good background on the changes in the British Constitution. One of the most important is separation of powers. Why did they do that?
I would say it's because of the declaratory acts and the tolerable acts that were passed by Parliament. That was the tyranny of the majority and the minority. The minority being colonists who had indirect representation in the British Parliament, and the tyranny of the majority being the British Parliament.
In Federalist 47, Madison stated that he was quoting Montesquieu. He stated that the legislative and executive authority should not be vested in the same person.
Why?
In Federalist 70, Alexander Hamilton stated that the executive should be the leading character with all the energy and
Going back to Ryan Howard, he felt that this would be the very definition. Imposing all judicial, legislative, and executive powers into one group of people or one person.
Also, going back to our statement, we mentioned that the Parliament has a multi-party system, and it can be debatable that in this form of system, since we have multi-parties, one of them, they tend to check on each other and they tend to form coalitions that kind of check the power of the majority and the minority, giving power to the minority as well.
Also in the Senate, right now the Republicans hold the Senate, and so the Democrats are kind of breathing down the backs of the Republicans to make sure that they're checking down.
What do you guys think of the authoritative parliamentary system?
Could you
Yeah, and I. All right, thank you.
Good morning. We're juniors from Wauwatosa West, representing Unit 5. I'm Allison Wendler.
I'm Stephen Anthony.
I'm Angelica Moser.
I'm Jessica Wilson.
I'm Thea Slaughter. We're here today with our instructor, Chad Murkowski, our teaching assistants, Aubriana Miro, Nicole Maestro, and Adam Pendos, and our mentors. A recent movie I've seen, The Star Wars: The Force Awakens.
Been watching a lot of Ashley lately, but I guess besides that, I've seen Harry Potter recently. I'm gonna go with the Minions.
Definitely Star Wars.
Also, Ashley related, I like the Green Mile.
All right, well, we are going with question 3. As you know, I'll read that. We've got what is the relationship, if any, between the Fourth Amendment and the principles of limited government and the rule of law? What is the relationship, if any, between the Fourth Amendment and a right to privacy and to freedom of conscience? Finally, the time the Constitution was adopted, all searches would have involved physical trespass. How have searches changed since then, and what causes those changes?
The core purpose of our government is to serve the people and protect their rights, one of the most important being the right to privacy. This principle was articulated in the case of Bringer v. United States, when Justice Robert Jackson stated that uncontrolled search and seizure is one of the first and most effective weapons in the arsenal of arbitrary government. At the time that the Constitution was written, unreasonable searches and seizures were fresh in the memories of those who achieved our independence.
One specific instance that caused the framers to pen the Fourth Amendment was the English case of Entick v. Carrington, in which the King's chief messenger broke into the home of John Entick in search of papers that would prove that Entick was publishing seditious writings. The decision espoused the idea that the great end for which all men entered into society was to secure their property. This would later become the foundation for the Fourth Amendment, which prevents the government from performing searches and seizures except in some very limited circumstances.
This limitation was further articulated in the landmark case of Weeks v. United States, where the court established the exclusionary rule, holding that evidence procured by the government in violation of the Fourth Amendment is not admissible in its case. This limitation on the executive branch, set forth by the rule of law, makes it necessary for government officials to procure evidence by means allowed by the Fourth Amendment, or the evidence found will be inadmissible in the court of law.
As stated in Boyd v. United States, the Fourth Amendment serves to protect the invasion of the sanctities of a man's home and the privacies of life. The framers, agreeing with Entick's decision, believed that every invasion of private property, be it ever so minute, is a trespass, and therefore included it in not only the Fourth Amendment, but also many additional constitutional amendments.
One type of privacy the framers were concerned about is the right of citizens to their private thoughts. Finding that the framers undertook to secure conditions favorable to the pursuit of happiness, Justice Brandeis wrote in his dissent in Olmsted v. United States that the framers recognized the significance of a man's spiritual nature, of his feelings, and of his intellect. They knew that only a part of the pain, pleasure, and satisfactions of life are to be found in material things. They sought to protect Americans in their beliefs, their thoughts, their emotions, and their sensations. They conferred, as against the government, the right to be let alone, the most comprehensive of rights, and the right most valued to civilized men.
These ideals were furthered in the case of Stanford v. Texas, in which Justice Stewart voiced the opinion that it is a constitutional requirement that warrants must particularly describe the things to be seized, and must be accorded the most scrupulous exactitude when the things are books, and the basis for their seizure is the ideas which they contain.
As noted by Justice Brandeis, in the application of a constitution, our contemplation cannot be only of what has been, but of what may be. In recent years, the Supreme Court has examined the constitutionality of technology, which does not require a physical trespass, but still implicates the Fourth Amendment, such as wordless thermal imaging in Kylo v. United States, and the examination of the content of a cell phone without a warrant in Riley v. California, finding them both to be unconstitutional.
In his opinion in Riley, Chief Justice Roberts wrote, "With all cell phones contain and all they may reveal, they hold for many Americans the privacies of life. The fact that technology now allows an individual to carry such information in his hand does not make that information any less worthy for the protection for which the founders fought."
In reiterating the importance of the Fourth Amendment's restriction against unreasonable searches and seizures, Justice Robert Jackson noted that when a government has the unchecked authority to search and seize, none is so effective in cowing a population, crushing the spirit of the individual, putting terror in every heart. This now concludes our statement, and we are ready for follow-up.
Under what circumstances do you think it might be justified for police to search without you?
I believe if the protection of the city or the people within that city is at risk, then the police are able to search a person without a warrant. For example, in the case of Terry v. Ohio, a police officer stopped and frisked a man because he believed he was going to rob a convenience store.
I believe that another exception to requiring a warrant in order to search would be the implicated degree doctrine, and this can be seen in the case of Texas v. Brown, where the police seized contraband on the front seat of a car.
This is also in plain view. This is also in the case of U.S. v. Worry, where, again, in a car, the man was seen to have marijuana sitting on the side of the seat next to him. And so the police had the probable cause to take that from a seize it.
Consent is also another thing. In the case of Rodriguez versus the United States, the police found a man in his home and asked if they could come in. He said no. His partner said yes. However, when they arrested the man and came back, they asked the partner again. She said yes. They entered the apartment because consent was given. They were allowed to go in without a warrant.
For exigent circumstances, police do have the authority to go in and search for any evidence that they feel may be destroyed or made to disappear, such as drunk driving and police pulling over someone, testing their blood alcohol content.
What do you think the interplay is between the protection against unreasonable searches and seizures and the protection against self-protection? Do you need to rephrase that?
Yes, please.
So you have a right against unlawful searches and seizures. You also have a right against incriminating. How does the right against those unreasonable searches and seizures relate to the right against self-regulation?
When you are arrested, you are given your Miranda rights, so you cannot, you have the right to remain silent, and so although the arresting process is defined as a search and a seizure, you still are made aware that you do not have to self-regulate yourself.
Also, we have to draw a line between what our right in the Fourth Amendment protects and also security, such as national security. So how much of our Fourth Amendment right do we possess? How much do we give away for the protection of our country?
I would relate this question to the case of Maryland v. King, where the Maryland state law says that DNA collection can be used for burglary and aggression, and they did use his DNA in this case, and it linked him to an unsolved rape case, which obviously that would be self-incrimination if he gave consent to his DNA, but he did not. However, the law required it. And I agree with Justice Scalia, actually, who was in the dissenting opinion in this case. It was decided that it was constitutional, but Justice Scalia said that the DNA Collection Act of Maryland actually serves as a general warrant because it does not require a specific case that they are searching for.
So in the case of the threat of terrorism approaches, do you think that it's appropriate to relax some of the requirements of for warrants and other requirements imposed on law enforcement by the Fourth Amendment in order to protect the people of the United States?
I believe that the Patriot Act signed by Congress and then George W. Bush, I believe that that is a good way to find terrorism before it may occur by the collecting of metadata, and which is who you may be calling.
However, I concur with Benjamin Franklin, who said, Those who sacrifice essential liberty in order to preserve a temporary safety deserve neither liberty nor safety. So I believe that loosening our Constitution just to find terrorists would be inappropriate.
The USA Freedom Act, which was just enacted last spring, protects against terrorism coming into our country by having the government monitor potential suspects within 72 hours, and within those 72 hours, if they feel necessary to continue monitoring, then they can obtain a warrant for surveillance.
Do you think that the exclusionary rule is a good way to enforce the warrant requirements?
Yes, I believe it acts as a check on the government. If a police officer knows that he or she might get the evidence dismissed, then they would be more careful in deciding whether or not to get a warrant. Especially now that warrants are so easily obtained, because you can get a warrant, you can email into a judge, and they can just send you back and give you a warrant.
An example of where the evidence was dismissed specifically in the States was back in Ohio, because the police did use a warrantless search and they found evidence, but they were not able to use it. And I believe that this is right because it goes against the Fourth Amendment rights, and the police should have to follow it.
Do you still agree with that, even if the exclusionary rule results in a piece of evidence against, say, a murderer being thrown out and that murderer is back on the streets and murder's going home?
The Constitution holds the exclusionary rule, and if you were to take in this evidence, even no matter what the circumstances are, the technicality would be the Constitution, and this is our Ohio.